lower class or peasant-like position. With Roland even being orphaned at such a young age, he never parents, though, unlike the Paladin Orlando, Roland didn't have a natural-born claim to fame. He had to earn his way out of the slums. As during his times living in the backstreet like one of the rats, Roland eventually came under the care and tutelage of a person who he'd only ever end up referring to as his Gran. This woman is all but directly confirmed to be the colored fixer Iori, the purple tier, who would instill into Roland the skills which would make him an above-average fixer, which got him started in fixer work at a relatively young age. Though, due to the line of work that Roland would end up taking as that said fixer, he, like most residents of the city, slowly began to degrade in his sense of self. Soon enough, he'd worked so much doing unseemly things for others that he had lost track of what he wanted for himself. Roland, losing sight of his personal identity to a more outward social one he created for his career, works perfectly in line with Roland's own character's relationship with the psychological concept of the persona, introduced by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung.
Oh boy, I can't escape you, can I?
From the name for an actor's mask in a stage play. This term is described as the mask which we create to deal with our own social hardships, while also concealing the true nature of our individual. Roland not only represents this idea in his career as a fixer, but also in his character throughout the whole of the game. But one of the biggest failings of the persona as well is a persona requires a strong ego to maintain control of it, as without that, the person risks fusing with their mask. As Carl Jung describes it, someone without a strong ego risks becoming identical to their persona, making them nothing more than a shallow conformist. Their identity becomes the mask, someone who lives entirely unconscious of any distinction between themselves and the world in which they live in. And as I mentioned, this all but perfectly describes Roland's character throughout a majority of the game, where he would even begin wearing a literal mask to reinforce this connection to the persona, but it also held a more diegetic purpose as well for his character, as Iori taught Roland the importance of keeping his identity a secret, because in the fixer line of work, leaving yourself vulnerable in any ways can get you killed. This is why he wore a perception blocking mask, which is an all-black mask that covers Roland's face in its entirety, leaving behind nothing but a dark void. He is almost an empty shell while wearing this. The effects of the mask also make it so that Roland appears as nothing more than a passerby in a crowd of noise, or lack thereof in some cases. Though it was this specific lack of self, alongside his own unique set of skills, that made Roland a perfect candidate to be enlisted into the Smoke Wars, which was an organized hostile takeover of the original L-Corp, an energy production company which provided power to the city before Lobotomy Corp. This old L-Corp was known for being a bit stingy, boosting the prices to the point that other major corps weren't too happy with them, though beyond the size of the energy bill, the byproduct of their energy production was also a major sore spot for the city, being this toxic smoke that caused extreme reactions in those who came in contact with it. And these reactions could either be emotional or physical, but soon enough, K-Corp, I-Corp, and ARC-Corp were all officially enlisted into the efforts, and these corps themselves would go on to hire offices, and more specifically fixers, to engage in the battles as well, with promises that those who performed well would eventually be paid lucrative sums of money and be given the option to migrate to the Nest, which is a rather coveted position within the city and comes with the protection of a corporate at your back. Which, with the setup of the Smoke Wars, it seems intentionally designed to mirror a series of religiously motivated military campaigns known as the Crusade, with Ein, Benjamin, and Dies all organizing the events to claim an area in which they felt they needed. The militia was also comprised of mostly like-minded individuals, from the Zealot Boyages to the mercenaries, which could be persuaded into giving their lives for grand promises of land, money, absolution, and divine eternal glory. As well, the Crusades even connect back to Roland, or Orlando, as during the initial campaigns designed to recruit soldiers to become part of the Crusades, the legend of Charlemagne and his Holy 12 Paladins were co-opted into proto-Crusade propaganda, with even some stories claiming that Charlemagne and his 12 knights rose from the dead to fight along the Crusaders. Now, during the Smoke War, Roland was under the assumed employment of K-Corp, and would focus on dismantling L-Corp employees along with their associates, being able to claim at least 23 lives before he would meet up with another fixer who would help him become more aware of the world around him. This being the older Salvador, a stern but kind-hearted fixer who was participating in the Smoke Wars not because he needed the reward, but instead because his office was the one hired to do its job. And Salvador would spend most of his time with Roland, acting as sort of his babysitter, teaching him things similar to how his grand would, even causing Roland to end up calling him Gramps later in life. Though, together, the two of them would witness something that they really shouldn't have. As within the facility of L-Corp was a creature of indescribable horror. The mere sight of it caused Roland to vomit uncontrollably, and the lasting mental damage of its presence would persist long past memory-erasing technology. Though, more importantly, while inside the labs of L-Corp, Roland would also ingest a large dosage of the L-Corp smoke, which helped alleviate ever so slightly his emotional numbness, helping him not only re-experience his emotions, but also allowed room from within his shadow for the seed of an ego to begin to form. Though it was this moment that also brought with it the overwhelming awareness of how the city worked. As, while he never really trusted Corpse before this, he now had evidence to suggest that no matter where he was in the city, he was never going to be truly safe. Even Salvador's presence here was a great example of this, as even though he was born into what anyone in the Backstreets would consider exceeding wealth, as Salvador himself is a nest-born citizen, he still involved himself with the dirty business of the world to stay afloat. As well, Salvador's lessons instilled in Roland the importance of never letting his guard down, which unfortunately would go on to breed a paranoia in the more emotionally vulnerable boy. As now, no matter how much he did, no matter how hard he worked, Roland could never escape the inevitable fate of his profession. The city itself is a monster that devours the weak, and things much larger than him run the world. He was less than a cog in this machine. He was barely rust on the surface of one of the gears. And because of this, Roland would continue to wear his mask, less now because of his grandmama's teachings, but more so as a much greater safety guard between his work and his true self. He had truly begun his persona integration, with his identity becoming the mask he wore. Though, with this all in mind, Roland would continue to find employment as a fixer, building up a good reputation and upping his grade until the point that he would be brought on as part of a Grade 1 fixer group before he had even earned the title himself. This group, of course, being Charles's office, a small fixer office which was comprised of multi-talented individuals. Soon enough, the head of this office would assign Roland as leader of his 12 fixers, which, of course, mirrors the literary origins of the character. These members of the office were all also named after the Knights of Charlemagne, of course, and within its ranks, Roland had two close friends, these two being Olivier and Astolfo, which were likely selected to reference the close allies of Orlando, with the two characters even serving similar purposes in Orlando's stories. Firstly, Olivier, sometimes referred to as Oliver, was Orlando's closest friend, advisor, and confidant, someone who was supposed to rein in the powerful knight when he had gone too far, but also support him in his actions, which Olivier describes his relationship with Roland to be quite similar, being Roland's friend since they first met, saying that he had gotten along with him better than any other fixer in Charles' office, while also feeling the need to be his partner so that he could rein Roland in during their jobs, as Roland had a habit of jumping into things without thinking. Though this wasn't always a bad thing. Olivier even grew to become envious of Roland's energy during their time together, with Roland even saving him a good number of times with his fast thinking, like during their first mission together in District 16, dealing with a culinary urban nightmare phenomenon called the Secret of the Demi-Glaze Sauce. And then you have Astolfo, who is based on the knight of the same name, which this knight is most notable for their role in Orlando Furioso specifically, where after Orlando goes mad with heartbreak, Astolfo is one of the ones who tries to directly comfort him in his madness, but after realizing that he can't fix him, he travels across the world to find a chariot which would allow him to reach the moon and recover Orlando's sanity, as all knights know that anything lost eventually ends up on the moon. The Astolfo of Charles' office is actually very similar in relation to Roland, being the only member of the 12 fixers to actually reach out to Roland and try to calm him following the events of the White Knight and Dark Days. As well, according to one of Roland's bad endings, Astolfo was one of the only people that Roland would consider his friend fully from that office, with one of the weapons used to kill him being a lance that belonged to a friend. And in that scene, Astolfo was even seen looking over his former friend's body, and according to legend, a weapon often associated with Astolfo is a lance or spear with a golden color. Now, Roland did consider his time in Charles' office to be some of his better memories, as not only was he able to make a good amount of money, but he also earned the fixer rank of grade 1, though soon enough, the office would end up introducing him to a person who would go on to impact his life the most out of anyone. This, of course, being the strange silver-haired woman from the outskirts, Angelica, though she was much more than just a pretty face, being ranked as a color fixer known as the Black Silence. And it's due in part to her status that she would be partnered up with Charles' office's own leader, Roland, to tackle a particularly difficult job, this being hunting a Star of the City level phenomenon known as a blood fiend, with the full title of the being Blood Red Knight. And while hunting the creature, both Angelica and Roland would begin to open up to each other, Angelica revealing not only her complicated and haunting past involving corp experiments and outskirts living, but also genuinely prying into Roland's own history, though she didn't do so out of some desire to fight his weakness or mock him, but to truly understand him as a person, which is a feeling that he hadn't experienced before this, as while he had friends, he didn't have anyone who cared for him like she seemed to. And together, thanks to their shared agonies, the two of them became a devastating team, defeating not only Blood Red Knight, but also, in the calm after, Angelica would literally shatter the mask which Roland used to hide his sadness, forcing him out of his shell and allowing him to be genuine with a person for the first time in his life. Roland would come to view Angelica like an angel or savior figure following these events. She had enlightened him to the possibilities of a brighter future, despite his dark and tattered past, and instilled in him a desire to live for himself rather than others, and not to take on the burdens or agonies of the city, because sometimes that's that and this is this, which became an infectious motto that would become Roland's answer to the hardships of the world, with Angelica teaching him the phrase not to discredit the suffering of others, but to create a divide between the agonies that he could and couldn't control. Angelica had become Roland's new foundation in a sense, and soon enough, the two would begin spending time together more frequently, either through missions or outside office work, Roland even making mention of borrowing Angelica's equipment from time to time to practice with it, until one day he would end up breaking one of her more expensive items, this being the Moot Workshop Katana, which was considerably expensive. And to apologize for this, Roland decided to drag her across the city to a specific place in the back streets, seemingly District 25, to enjoy a nice meal together, this location being Don Juan's Pub, a bar and grill combination restaurant with food unlike any others in the back street. The name of the pub is actually a running reference throughout the series of Project Moon's games in reference to its character artist, Kim Don Juan. Though this whole event just highlights a somewhat understated element of Roland's character, which is, he's a bit of a foodie. Not only is it seen in his hobby of cooking, but Roland understands the importance of good food and has a fascination with finding diamonds in the rough throughout the backstreets. like this pub in particular. And it's this element of Roland's character that not only helps flesh out his own familiarity with different backstreets, but also shows his particular taste for quality. We've even seen evidence to suggest that Roland would risk his life before on missions to try out new and interesting food, like with the aforementioned Urban Nightmare tier demi-glace sauce. Hell, Roland even managed to break through the walls of fiction and reality to help bring one of his favorite restaurants into our world. This, of course, being the beloved Ham Ham Pang Pang. Originally appearing as just a sandwich chain that started in District 13's backstreets, whose food quality was so good that it actually improved the mental state of all those around the restaurant, even Roland became quite a fan of their toasted sandwiches. It would eventually go on to become a real cafe in our world, located in Suwon, South Korea, with its appearance in-game appearing about 1 month before it would be announced IRL, and thus has become a very popular location for visiting fans, with Project Moon using it to promote their works with many different game theme events, and of course selling exclusive merchandise there. I do want the warp hat. Give it to me. Though, back to Don Juan's, Roland hoped that the food there would be enough to apologize for the mishap with her sword, but Angelica's interpretation of the events was him indirectly asking her on a date, which in turn resulted in both parties ending up confessing their feelings for each other, with the two of them eventually getting married and building up a savings doing a ton of fixer work. They eventually settled down out of the fixer lifestyle and moved into a comparably spacious apartment in the best neighborhood they could find, this being the backstreets of District 9, as they both believed the more artistic and musical nature of District 9 made it a relatively safe area to live versus other parts of the city. Though Roland, even while retired, continued to work underworld or shady jobs that only a fixer of his caliber was equipped to, like when he intercepted an Kefelian trade for Oakport by issuing out a shady contract to its dealer, with the ultimate goal of doing these jobs being that he wished to earn Nest migration papers, so he and his wife could live a much more comfortable life in a better place. Though, after learning that Angelica was pregnant, he made the decision to try to cash in his Smoke War veteran benefits. This way he could move him and his wife into a nest without much of a headache, and they could actually retire. Though, in doing so, he was reminded of the grim reality of this world, because even after all the work he did, all the people's lives he ruined, the Corps did not hold true to their promises, with I-Corp, K-Corp, and O-Corp discarding him without a second thought, changing the contract he signed so that it could deny veteran access after a certain point, leaving Roland without any options. And the happier his life got, the more the looming dread that something or someone could take it away from him began to creep in. Then came the day where Roland received a call from one of his close friends, Olivier, a former member of Charles' office, and someone who desperately needed his assistance on a mission in District 25. Roland felt like he needed to help as well due to Olivier's connections, that in doing this task, he might earn himself some migration papers, so he went to Angelica to ask her if he should go. She then assured him in his decision, telling him that she'll be here waiting for him when they get back. And in strong spirits, Roland departed, and it is during the events of this mission that a glowing beam of golden light would soon erupt from the nest of District 12. This beautiful warmth that drowned out the dreary darkness that clouded over the city. For 3 days, the people of the city experienced a surplus of emotions and enjoyment. These moments were referred to as the White Nights. But just as quickly as the light came, it vanished, and for 4 days, pure darkness clouded the city. This event is referred to as the Dark Days, and it was during this time, down in a crummy underground bar in the rougher areas of District 9, a down-on-his-luck musician would hear the voice of his beloved instrument cry out to him. In this despair, he would begin to smash his body into a piano, slamming his hands and face into the keys over and over again, as his anguish began to be countered out by the euphoric bliss of fusing with his beloved instrument. Until soon, the piano itself began to grow in size, its elegant keys elongated, with the man's arms growing in turn. The patrons of the bar watched on in horror as the more the man played the piano, the greater his body distorted. And this sound eventually took on a physical form as the bodies of the bargoers began to contort into note-like shapes. The music of this backstreets performer now being heard all across the city. And those unlucky enough to be close to the piano itself would be absorbed and melded into the megastructure. This is the first reported case of the distortion phenomenon, known simply as the pianist. And it's this incident that resulted in the death of 80% of District 9's population, with citizens either being dissolved into music-like notes or being fused together with the piano, which, due in part to the apocalyptic nature of this disaster, the Zwei Association issued an emergency response, dispatching their colored fixer, the Blue Reverberation, also known as Argelia, who just so happened to be the brother of Angelica. Though, by the time that Argelia arrived, the pianist had already been dealt with, his arms severed and his body laid slump over his keys, as, assumedly in response to the word about the pianist, Roland had returned home to find it in ruins. And thus he donned his mask and took Durandal in hand. Roland would jump the pianist, ending his performance.
I've never seen that guy do that attack before.
Amongst the rubble and ruins that comprised the piano, Roland noticed a familiar body, his beloved Angelica. Her being now melded into the base of the piano, a hand extended out in agony. Roland was long too late to save his angel, and in one night, the city had taken from him his wife, his unborn child, and his hopes of any beautiful future. In his grief, Roland would begin to wear his wife's gloves. Though he might have actually started wearing them to slay the pianist itself, it is not entirely clear here, as the gloves themselves, when worn, have a silencing effect that counteract the pianist's own music. So it's very possible that Roland's first kill with these gloves, which are the signature tool of the Black Silence, was the pianist. But again, that is mostly speculation. What isn't speculation is how he would begin to use them to achieve his vengeance. As Roland began to compile a list of suspects who could have possibly been responsible for such a needless disaster, from underground associates, monstrous cultists, or even other fixer agencies, Roland was thorough with this list, and once he had finished it, he began checking names off it in a wrath-filled massacre that stretched across the whole city. From slaughtering a scientist who had begun kidnapping people for the purpose of turning them into gears. Likely because his research of disfiguring people into gears reminded him of properties of the pianist's own music. Roland then eradicated a factory and its workers who were attempting to revive the dead through puppetry, with the result being a complete perversion of life, wrapping the bodies of kidnapped citizens into a massive clump, which, of course, resembles the nature of the pianist's own piano. He even ended up targeting the cartel he used to do business with, Roland eventually managing to cripple one of the five-finger syndicates in its entirety, this of course being the middle finger, causing them to go all but extinct. Though, his rampage soon became a formless bloodbath, as he just began slaughtering fixer agencies who had nothing to do with him, leaving a countless pile of bodies in his wake, operating the entire time under the guise of his wife's former identity, the Black Silence. And all of these events are in part a direct reference to Roland's namesake, and more specifically, Orlando Inamoroto and Orlando Furioso. To summarize shortly, the name of his wife and brother-in-law come directly from the main love interest of Orlando Inamoroto, this being the beautiful Angelica, Princess of Cathay, who was known to be a flirt that liked to lure in men and watch them fight over her. She oftentimes would have them battle her brother, Argelia, who was a fierce warrior of his own. Angelica would go on to meet Orlando alongside his allies of Ronaldo and a few other knights, depending on which version you're reading, and would have them duel in order against her brother Argelia for her hand in marriage. Eventually, an unsavory third party would mortally wound Argelia, causing Angelica, Orlando, and Ronaldo to flee to her kingdom. Though during the travels there and back, a lot of weird love-related miscommunication would occur, but most importantly, Orlando would end up getting feverishly jealous of Ronaldo and would erupt into a violent act of swordsmanship, until eventually, at the request of King Charlemagne, who was in desperate need of his greatest knights to assist him fending off an invading force in France, requested that Angelica use the safety of his country as the final test of love for the powerful knight. And while this did work to bring Orlando back to France, his fighting became feverish and brutal, as his want for a perfect life with Angelica caused him to get more and more destructive rather than helpful. And matters were made even worse when Angelica would eventually be gifted a magic ring that caused her to vanish from the world, making it impossible impossible for Orlando to ever find her after the war, and while in her lost state, she would eventually fall for another man, this being a simple infantry soldier of a low-class status, essentially a nobody compared to Roland. And the only reason she fell for him is that she got to nurse him back to health when she found him injured in the woods. And it was the announcement of their marriage that completely drove Orlando over the edge. His rage spread across his own country like a destructive hurricane until he was force-fed his wits by Astolfo and Olivier, causing him to fall out of love with Angelica and eventually let her go. And a good deal of these poems can be seen in Roland's love story with Angelica, as she was always the one who controlled the relationship similar in manner to the Angelica of the poems. As well, Roland shares Orlando's confrontational history with Argilia, a brother who he'd have to have defeated in combat in order to win Angelica's hand, with Roland even constantly calling Argilia insulting names and not being very fond of his personality even before he went insane. As well, Angelica is lost to Roland while he is out on an important mission, fighting alongside his fellow paladins for a specific cause, and of course it was a mission given to him by a close ally. Roland is also seen working extra hard at the jobs that he does because he wants to guarantee a beautiful future with his wife. As well, his destructive rampage following the events of the White Knights and Dark Days is comparable on scale to that of the Legendary Knights, as even other colored fixers of notable skill levels were unsure if they could have even dealt with Roland in his prime if he ever came knocking, as seen in Leviathan during Virgilius' flashback to his one encounter with Roland at this time. And the poem's rampage is even represented perfectly in Roland's deck, being tied to his own original skill, Orlando, and its strongest skill card, Furioso. Though again, unlike the Knight, Roland's rampage would see him stripped of all his merits, the Hana Association demoting him back down to the status of a grade 9 fixer and blacklisting him from most offices, which in turn forced Roland to begin his own agency, a single-man office, where he would wallow in his own misery, spending nights alone in a home which was slightly too big for a single person and was decorated like a time capsule of a better world. An empty crib sitting in the corner waiting longingly for a child who would never arrive. Though, in his loneliness, he would be revisited by a woman we hadn't seen in years. A purple viper looking to give him a shot at a being who had brought him this misery. This visitor was his adopted grandmother and personal trainer, Iori, the Purple Tear, and she brought him news of a location in Elcorp's Nest known as the Library. Likely understanding his loss, Iori would offer him a job of a lifetime, as inside the newly emerging phenomenon known as the Library was likely the source of his grief, and using her special talents, she could easily get him inside, and from that point on, he would have the freedom to do as he pleased, which means he could eventually decide the fate of the being behind the White Knights and Dark Days. Roland agrees to this idea, and thus begins the events of Library of Runa. With Roland appearing within the library, seemingly out of nowhere, he was soon greeted by a pale woman draped in all black. This was the director of the library and an all-powerful being within its walls. She quickly dismembered Roland with a snap of her fingers, questioning him all the while on why and how he arrived. Thinking quick, Roland began to explain his position through sprinkles of truth, telling her he didn't exactly understand how he got to the library himself, and how he had simply just been in District 13 one second and was here the other. The director, realizing now that he wasn't a threat, reassembles Roland, even giving him a few enhancements of her own, and then offers him employment as a librarian within her walls, introducing herself as Angela, a name which strikes a chord with Roland almost immediately, but he begrudgingly accepts her offer and is assigned as the patron librarian of the floor of General Works, also known as the Keter floor. His job there was to greet guests to the library and fight them to the death, so that they would then become books within the library's shelves and share information of the outside world with Angela, who was in pursuit of the perfect book which could help her become truly human and be able to leave the shackles she was bound with. And thus Roland would begin to bide his time in the library, working for Angela and waiting for the perfect moment to act. And it is in this process that he gets a much more up-close perspective at the underworkings of the city. As well, very familiar to his old work as a fixer, this new job required him to kill a lot of people. From down-on-their-luck fixers with griefs of their own, monstrous phenomena that haunt the back streets, and old associates of his, such as Oscar, Eugen, and even Salvador. Though none of those he met within the library realized who they were facing. as Roland had hid his face through most of his career. And due in part to the nature of the perception-blocking mask, it made him hard to remember or even notice. As well, throughout the course of the game, Roland avoids bringing up or even mentioning his past without being directly asked about it, as he's trying to avoid blowing his cover by any means necessary. But if confronted on it, he isn't unwilling to share. And because of this, ever so slightly, Angela begins to piece together that Roland is more than he claims to be. As well, while the people of the city would begin dying, the library itself would slowly become a more lively place, as those slumbering within its walls begin to slowly spring awake, one by one. These all being the returning cast of Lobotomy Corps, the Sephiroth, and Abnormalities, with the Sephiroth being reincarnated yet again, though with all of their memories intact and a new assignment given to them by Angela involving the nature of the city and humans as a whole. And together with Roland, they all begin greeting their own guests, crawling abnormalities within the library, and eventually reaching different types of realizations about the city and the nature of Angela's actions as a whole. And it is through these actions that Roland learns that Angela is directly responsible for the distortion phenomena, and in turn, is the person who killed his wife. And it was all due to a tantrum that she threw at the end of Lobotomy Corps. With this, Roland now knew his target fully, but he couldn't do it until the right moment. Partly because, as she was now, Angela was unkillable, so he needed her to become more human. But also, he wanted to know her reasonings for why she did what she did, and what she planned to do after she was successful. But most importantly, he wanted to snub her right before she had achieved her true happiness, delivering her a death full of the suffering that she had indirectly inflicted him with, one that he felt she fully deserved. So Roland continued to wear his mask, the personality of a cool-headed and quippy fixer, someone who just let go of all of his problems, because sometimes that's that, and this is this. Though, the longer he worked for Angela, the more her story became prevalent to him. Seeing the reasons behind her emotional outbursts, learning the full history of her cursed existence, which led to literally 1,000,000 years worth of suffering that she could do nothing about. And eventually, she would be discarded to the wayside by her creator, and expected to just lay down and die after serving her purpose. All feelings that Roland had become all too familiar with himself. Angela and him weren't too different. He could even say that he considered her his friend after a while, and the two of them would begin growing more and more comfortable with each other's presence, Angela eventually referring to him by his name, and Roland sharing with her his own history. Though, alongside getting to know Angela, Roland would get to know the other patrons of the library, with 4 of them mattering the most to his story in specific, these 4 being Tifereth, Gebbera, Hesed, and Bina, all with personalities that conflicted or retroactively redefined Roland's own personal values. So let's begin with one of my personal favorite of the Sephiroth, Tifereth, who gains her name from the 6th branch of the Kabbalic Tree of Life and is a representation of spirituality, compassion, and the balance in oneself. Described as delightful and glorious, the Tifereth is a beacon of light that is represented greatly in her character, as she is someone who, while openly aggressive and, for lack of a better word, tsundere, is still one of the most level-headed of the Sephiroth, being the first person in the library who Roland meets that isn't openly hostile towards Angela after the ending of Lobotomy Corps. Not because she isn't angry, though, but because she isn't able to fully blame Angela after learning her story, and saves her judgment on Angela until after she has made her final decision on what she'll do with her life. She even doesn't hold it against Angela for puppeting them within the library, as Angela is simply doing to them what Ein did to her, if not being more charitable by not treating the librarians as expendable. Though, this more positive outlook of Tifereth doesn't seem to come from blind optimism. Instead, it was developed through the pain he suffered due in part to the events of Lobotomy Corps, watching helplessly as her brother was killed and revived over and over again. With each time that the pain drove them mad, they would be disposed of and replaced. This perversion of her brother's memory brought out a writhing nihilism in Tiff, until eventually she was able to conclusively see her brother's suffering come to an end. Her character growth of being able to accept death and move on from it is a vital element to Roland's own development as a character, and it is during their conversations that Roland is slowly forced to confront his own nihilistic feelings about the city and his life, these agonies that he is allowed to fester in his heart for well too long. which in part were forced onto him by the city, though it is Tifereth's brutal honesty in her words that cut deep with Roland. As well, her tendency for physical violence during arguments reminds him a lot of his lost Angelica. Tifereth shows Roland that holding on to the memories of someone precious, while painful, doesn't need to make you hopeless. That drowning yourself in misery will never help anything. And it is these words that eventually cause Roland's emotions to reach a critical state, and the abnormalities associated with Tifereth's floor all begin to resonate with him, fusing with Roland in his empty state and gifting him a shifting mass of corrosive, overwhelming egos. With the first abnormality to resonate with Roland being the Queen of Hatred, a magical girl who embodies the concept of love and whose whole purpose in life is defeating villains. Though, because she attributes her value based on the existence of evil, she herself at her core also embodies hatred. As if she is left in a peaceful state for too long, she will slowly begin to question her very purpose in life until she reaches the conclusion that to justify her existence, she needs to become a villain for others to fight. Her love essentially drives her mad, which are elements that are directly relevant to Roland's own journey for a purpose and how when his purpose was stripped away from him, he became an uncontrollable monster. Next, Roland would Vessel the Servant of Wrath, the only one of the magical girl abnormalities to not make an appearance in Lobotomy Corp's main game, but instead would appear in the comic side series Wonder Labs. Servant of Wrath, much like the other magical girls, believes that there is an importance to fairness and balance in the world, though eventually found the courage to reach out to others to trust them, but after being manipulated by a sinister figure who stole everything from them and thus turned those they loved into puppets, they lost themselves to rage and hunted the hermit in a beast-like state. Roland embodies this abnormality in so many ways, some that I haven't even mentioned yet, but more importantly, one element of Servant of Wrath's story in Wonder Lab is their relationship with an employee named Biozi, who believed friendship was a mutual exploitation of one another, which is almost verbatim how Roland describes his friendship with Angela throughout most of the game. Following this, Roland then embodies the Knight of Despair, a powerful magical girl knight that represents the feelings of despair felt by someone who initially fought in the name of justice and valued an empire to create a better world, only to learn the truth of said world or empire is violent and dreary, and thus, those they fought for lost sight of what once made them so wonderful, which in turn distorted the knight into someone who would turn their blade on the very world they once fought to save, with the lore of the Knight of Despair describing it as someone who, through a repeated cycle of faith and betrayal, was left with only one emotion that is expressed through black tears, which has many connecting points back to Roland, but more specifically in his early history, with him learning the truth of the city causing him immense psychological discomfort and the looming dread associated with knowing that no matter what he did, it was all for naught. As well, the term knight works very well with his sort of boy-soldier-like history, and of course ties back to the knights and paladins of Charlemagne legend. And then finally, Roland has the King of Greed take shape in his body, the final of the magical girls, and someone who represents the idea that happiness is rooted in greed and will eventually become an all-consuming sadness thanks to the nature of happiness being unquenchable. And her powerful, all-consuming view on happiness is reflected in Roland's own mindset, as he doesn't believe that there's any true way to become happy anymore, instead choosing to seal himself off in a cage of his choosing, much like how the King of Greed seals herself off in a massive chamber of amber, though both of these cages are very capable of becoming terrifying beasts. Though, once all 4 phases of the boss rush have been completed, Roland's ego will take its true shape, this being the Rudia original, Jester of Nihil, an embodiment of nihilism and the belief that life itself has no value. More specifically, it's a boss fight that encapsulates Roland's mindset throughout his life up to this point, including his connection to the mask of the persona, as the Jester of Nihil is literally wearing the type of mask that inspired the word. Also, this form in which Roland takes is supposed to represent both the Fool in the Tarot set, but also the Trump card or Joker from a deck of playing cards. As not only is it a common motif for Roland as a character, but also works in line with the magical girl's own playing card suit theme. His role as the Joker also gives him control over the negative aspects of the magical girls, with the Joker being literally a trump card, trumping all of their achievements, with them all appearing on his side as hollow shells of what they are supposed to represent. As well, his screen text reflects Roland's own feelings on the uncertainty and trauma inflicted on him by by the city, though as the fight progresses, Tifereth and her assistants remind Roland that it is through the pain that these magical girls represent that allows them to become better. As in defeating the shells of Niall's summons, the assistants of Tifereth can embody the positive feelings created by these agonies. Soon, greed returns to happiness, hatred dissolves into love, despair solidifies into justice, and wrath reforms into courage. And for the first time, these four figures stand together. But instead of bringing untold disaster like Lobotomy Corp had warned about, instead, they bring hope, defeating Niall and snapping Roland out of his unstable mental state, reminding him that while there is fear involved with losing yourself, life isn't about how you used to be, but more so who you are now and where you're going to be, and that you should carry the memories of who you used to be into that future. She helped Roland see the smallest glimmer of light in the distance to the long dark tunnel that has been his misery.
내게는 고통밖에 없습니다. 그것 말고는 아무것도 바라지 않았습니다. 고통은 내게 충실했고 지금도 변함이 없습니다.
That's why I wanted to bring the witch.
Now, while on the Tree of Life, Tifereth is greatly connected to all of the Sephiroth, the two that she is directly next to are Gebra and Hesed, who, much like Tifereth, had a great deal of impact on Roland's character. So let's start first with our coffee-consuming connoisseur, Hesed, whose relationship with Roland is actually a rather complicated one. As similar to Tifereth, Hesed's name implies that he has a specific view, with Hesed specifically meaning a love for people or kindness, which represents his unparalleled love for others despite their flaws. And this makes him a great foil compared to the jaded Roland, who has grown to hate other people, even writing off others' hardships as not his problem with the twisted phrase, "That's that, and this is this." Now, their conversations together often consist of the usage of coffee making as a surrogate for discussing the popularism enacted by the city throughout its nest filtering process, removing a person's individualism as they are blended down into a powder of the collective within the nest, which the popularism of the city has become extremely successful, with most people being separated into either two categories, nest dwellers or backstreet rats. Even Roland, someone with a lot of experience of finding diamonds in the rough by living in the backstreets most of his life, firmly believes that there's literally no better alternative to living than in a nest, even if it saps away one's individuality, which is a thought pattern that Hesed views as cowardly, seeing right through Roland's defensive statements about the city being unchangeable and more or less calling him out for running away from his problems, as caving to the demands of a powerful figure with a gun to your back is a haunting mindset that Hesed is all too familiar with in his past life, a weakness that he has grown to see past the flaws of thanks to his time in Lobotomy Corp. Along with this, Hesed believes firmly that people can create change in the city, while Roland vehemently disagrees with this idea, even if he does agree with Hesed's previous statement about his cowardice, as Roland understands more than most how unnecessarily cruel the city is, as well as how difficult it is to try to be yourself in it, though he also believes just simply knowing the city's awful truth doesn't change anything, as knowing without the ability to take action just leaves one feeling helpless and in despair, with their conversation steering close to the views of promises being a key focus on the difference between mindsets. As Roland claims, promises are only possible for those who have power, as he once tried to keep a promise to Angelica, one which said that he wouldn't wallow in his misery if anything unfortunate happened to her while he was away. Yet, despite all his power and knowledge, he still broke this said promise, lashing out against the city and experiencing the tidal wave of consequences crashing back down on him. The city always wins at the end, and it had tarnished even his last memories of his wife. And it is these same memories that would eventually cause Roland to resonate with all the abnormalities on Hesed's floor. These being the Scarecrow of Searching Wisdom, the Warm-Hearted Woodsman, the Road Home and Scaredy Cat, and Ozma, which all together make up the major cast of the story, The Wizard of Oz, which seems rather intentional, as it relates not only to the themes of Hesed's floor conversation, as The Wizard of Oz is often associated with one of its popular readings of the narrative, this being the Littlefield interpretation, which states that The Wizard of Oz is a political allegory for the concept of popularism in the West, with the story being written during the Gilded Age of American history, where the East and the West empires had begun draining the resources out from the common people. Many elements of the story can even be traced back to the roles of the characters, like how the Scarecrow can represent the farmers of America, America, considered to be too simple for luxury goods, when in reality they had levels of resourcefulness unmatched by the higher-ups of the city dwellers in the East and West. Project Moon even called back to the original roots of Wizard of Oz with their road home design, as it's very clear that she is supposed to be Dorothy, but she is specifically Dorothy from the original story, as she is wearing silver slippers instead of ruby ones like in the movie, which silver was vital for Littlefield's interpretation, as it represented the everyman's currency, and this is because the People's Party wanted to add silver to the gold standard. Thus, this is why Dorothy wore a pair of silver slippers to walk the Golden Brick Road. As well, Roland possesses elements of the other characters in Wizard of Oz. Firstly, you have the Tin Man, a hard-working everyman who wishes to have his own heart. Roland reflects this in his cold-blooded nature, making him appear heartless to others, especially when he dismisses the agonies of other city dwellers. As well, the Tin Man's hopes to gain a heart relates to the purpose of speaking to Hesed to begin with, as the Coffee Man helps the Sandwich Man redevelop his own sense of empathy, or metaphorically, he gives him his heart. And then you have the Cowardly Lion, an extraordinarily powerful figure who's too scared to do anything on his own, which is reflected in the fact that Roland is a considerably strong fixer who still chooses to play by the rules of the city, as he's too scared of the repercussions of what would come if he ever did act on his own. He doesn't yet possess the courage to protect others. As well, you have Dorothy, who relates to Roland in a lot of ways, some that I can't get into too directly, but she is someone of a somewhat simple upbringing who suffers from a life-altering event which is brought on by a force of nature, this of course being the tornado that destroys her home, scoops her up, and leaves her alone in the big scary world of Oz, which has obvious correlations that I don't think I need to re-mention here. You can also read Dorothy's meeting of both the Wicked Witch and Glinda as his encounter with both faces of Angela, though, much like Dorothy reminding herself that there's no place like home, eventually Roland's own desires are what helps lead him to a place that he can then call home. Though, once all the characters are dealt with, Roland then becomes the embodiment of the city itself, taking on the ego of the False Throne, a representation of both the Emerald City from Wizard of Oz, but is also a great example of the city itself. As throughout the fight, Roland will bestow gifts to certain marked librarians, and these gifts come with lies of their own, in a similar fashion to how the city promises a happy life in the nest for residents, or promises that you can get into a nest, when in reality, it's nothing but lies. And the gifts given out by the city clearly have inspiration from the story's influence on the floor as a whole, but these negative ideas tied to these gifts come with comments that clearly are directed inwards towards Roland, such as his comment aimed at the Tin Man, by gifting him the ability to love, only to remind them that they will never truly understand love because of who they are. Though,
what about making it so they can't find it? Because they're ugly
and the
or
two
something.
librarians share one last exchange. Hesed assures Roland that knowledge is an important part of change, and even if you can't do anything at the moment, being able to recognize that life isn't acceptable as it is now is important. You may not be able to change anything on your own. With the right group of like-minded individuals, anything is possible. As knowledge can become the strength that people need to brave the waves of change and eventually reach the better world that they all desire. Which, interestingly enough, as its floor, is supposed to represent braving the waves of change, with the main battlefield which he uses to greet guests on being a massive pirate ship.
내 영혼이 시련의 바닥을 헤맬 때에도 고통은 늘 곁에 앉아 날 지켜주었으니 어떻게 고통을 원망하겠습니까?
Though, if there was anyone better suited to teach Roland the strength to brave change, it would have to be the patron librarian of the Floor of Language, Gebbera. As Gebbera and Roland are actually a lot more similar than either might want to admit, with one of the core themes of Gebbera's interactions being about power or strength, with the name Gebbera even being translated directly to strength, though its role in the Tree of Life is an understanding of one's limitations and judgments, which fits perfectly with Gebbera's views on strength, as it is the limitation that you set on your own growth which can help you become stronger than anyone else. As due to her own history within the city, she began to view strength as the end-all, be-all to everything in the world. seeing more often than not that those who are gifted with strength tend to strike downwards instead of upwards. Though, after meeting someone like Carmen, she found that strength and power is more important when used to protect someone you care about than when used for your own selfish gain. As Carmen not only gave her a physical representation of power in the form of ego, but also Gebra only really found her purpose in life working for Carmen to ensure that someone who was weaker than her could achieve her dreams. She would also end up experiencing a similar bout of insanity and rage following the death of Carmen, though this wasn't truly felt until around the establishment of Lobotomy Corp. As in becoming a Sapphira, Gebra lost almost all of her values and identity, with her own meltdown in Lobotomy Corp holding a lot of similarities to Roland's own slaughter of the many suspects he thought responsible for Angelica's death. Though where Roland came out the other end more jaded and furious than before, Gebra came to her senses, realizing why she was given the strength she was. She found the courage to protect the memories of her dearly beloved friends. Though, unlike where the other two realizations caused Roland to get angry, since Gebra was one of his fixer heroes, instead, his mind rejects that someone so similar to him could have possibly ignored the temptation of vengeance like Gebra did, and then resonates with the abnormalities on the floor. And these abnormalities, while all having their own special meaning attached to them, are probably the most direct to Roland's character. Firstly, he takes the shape of the Little Red Riding Hood mercenary, which represents his role as a fixer, a line of work that can be best described as a mercenary, as well his hunt for the Big Bad Wolf being Roland's bloody investigation into the person who could have possibly killed his Angelica, which similar ideas are also represented in the second phase, with the Big and Will Soon Be Bad Wolf representing Roland's rampage to come, as he may have been good at playing the part of a retired fixer and living a normal life. The city had crafted him into a monster, which then leaves a pile of corpses in the wake of his outburst. This pile weighs on his mind and reminds him that he can never have Angelica back. Hey, what's that in phase 3? And then we have Nosferatu, which is seemingly a blood fiend who wasn't able to be implemented into the original Lobotomy Corp. He has clear ties to Roland's own history with Blood Red Knight, but also has a unique name in this form, Dipsia, which is an ancient Greek and Italian word for thirst, representing how bloodthirsty Roland had become in the wake of his beloved's death. Nothing left inside him but a monster wearing the skin of a normal person, which is also perfectly represented in his final stage with nothing there, or mimicry, an abnormality known for being a terrifying beast that will endlessly try to mimic the appearance of other humans. Nothing there is madness personified, and with one desire, to escape and wreak havoc on those around them. It is a perfect representation of Roland's rampage, though Gebra is eventually able to overcome Roland and snap him out of it, reminding him that while wrath and hatred can become a powerful weapon, if not wielded properly, it can end up hurting more than just your enemies.
고통이여. 넌 결코 내게서 떠나지 않겠기에 난 마침내 너를 존경하기에 이르렀다.
Then finally, resting just above Gebra in the Tree of Life, is the last of the Sephiroth, which Roland needed to interact with, this being the former head assassin turned tea-sipping grandma, Bina. A previous arbiter for A-Corp, she is a living human experiment with remnants of multiple singularities built into her biology. And she was all too familiar with the nature of the city and the people in it, even making it clear that she sees right through Roland's act out the gate. She knows full well that he is here by his own will and is waiting to seize an opportunity, which works quite well with Bina's own role in the Tree of Life, being the wisdom of a lived life, as well as the ability to understand one's purpose. As well, Bina can work as an unavoidable mirror which reflects only the truest parts of oneself. And this aspect of her is reflected directly in her conversations regarding the agonies of life and how Roland may blame the city for his agonies, but he is just as responsible for his own state of mind. Though the longer he talks with Bina, the more his heart resonates with the abnormalities on her floor, all of which represent the wings in one way or another, or more specifically, the city as a whole, as these birds keep to their nest and bring forth despair in their action. Though, unlike the other abnormalities that Roland has resonated with, the birds aren't really tied to his story so much as they're tied to the city as a whole, and honestly they have a greater connection to Vaina than Roland, but you can make some loose connections though, with the Judgment Bird skill motif being Roland comparing his own agonies along with weighing profits throughout most of his life, but I don't think these abnormalities really relate to him so much. What is extremely important about this conversation with Vaina is the end of it all. Vaina makes him confront the fact that while he may believe that he is simply a piece of rust on the gears which grind away in the city, that he is still capable of bringing those gears to a halt, much like the mastermind of Lobotomy Corp did all those years ago, even if it is only for a brief moment. Roland doesn't need to continue the cycle of death and violence if he so chooses to, no matter how much he's convinced himself he has to.
나는 알고 있나니 내가 죽음의 자리에 드는 날에도 너는 내 마음속으로 깊이 들어와 나와 함께 가시려니 누우리라.
As well, at the end of each of these realizations, Roland will begin to quote a poem that his wife often liked to say herself, this being The Prayer for Loving Sorrow by Francis James, which has become almost a mantra for him of sorts. Roland reminding himself that his sorrows and agonies are the only things that will never leave him, welcoming them into his heart so that he can continue to live. These are, in a way, the moments of his past self reminding him of his mission, why he's in the library, an unhealthy heartbeat of vengeance that boils beneath his persona of a cool and confident grade 9 fixer, always appearing right after some sort of grand realization about himself to keep him on the right path that drove him here, and eventually that path would lead Roland to reuniting with his former friend. As during Roland's series of personal realizations and growth, the library has become quite a threat itself, and has now become a direct target of the Hana Association, as it had achieved a threat status beyond the star of the city, and thus it needed to be dealt with Hana sending South Section 3 to the library, and they were eventually welcomed in by Angela, before eventually succumbing to the fate of all those who entered the library before them. Though Olivier, a member of Section 3, left before his associates could be killed, as he needed to deal with the threat in a different way. Firstly, upon re-entering, Olivier would attempt to slice the head of Angela clean off, though, to his dismay, even with all the life she's absorbed so far, Angela was far from human enough to die from this, so he then resorted to his backup plan, a torture device created using T-Corp's singularity. It would paralyze the target and then fry the brain, making a person experience 1,000 years worth of time in a single second, which is an extremely cruel fate for Angela specifically, though Roland prevented his friend from being fried in this way, breaking the device before telling Angela that he would handle Olivier himself. Then, the two friends have one final chat with each other, preparing for their conclusive duel to the death, Olivier even gifting Roland the gloves of the Black Silence, revealing later to be the thing that he had left the library initially to go get. And once Roland had donned these gloves, his true potential had awakened, as it is these gloves that possess a unique series of abilities that make them an incredibly deadly tool in and of themselves. Firstly, when worn, the gloves emit a noise-canceling ability, which deafens the world around the user, with an unspecified range, but the effect itself is weirdly noticeable due to how it brings an unnatural silence to the world. Hence why the gloves are often associated with the Black Silence themselves. Well, the gloves are also capable of reaching into a hammer space of sorts, being able to materialize a specialized inventory of weapons, all of high-quality construction, and all coming from different workshops in the city, meaning those who wield the gloves must be a master of arms themselves. And before Roland took on the title of the Black Silence, it did originally belong to his wife, Angelica, who was originally the Black Silence during her time at Charles' office, with her gloves being a key part to her attire as well. And the game and design documents make it clear that Roland was never actually officially declared to be the Black Silence, but he does resonate with the identity, meaning that even though the Hana Association may never have given him the ring, Roland is the Black Silence. And in turn, the player even gains the ID of the Black Silence, which contains the specialized trait, Orlando, clearly a callback to his name's origin. And from this point on, the player can utilize Roland to his full potential, as this ID comes equipped with a specialized series of pages that match up with all the workshop tools in his inventory void. So I thought it'd be interesting to go over each of them. Firstly, you have the only weapon which Roland explicitly added to the arsenal of the Black Silence, this being the previously mentioned sword, Durandal, which of course ties back to Roland's own namesake and I covered earlier in the video. And then you have the tools of Atelier, this being a pair of powerful handguns that then can transition into a large ornate rifle called the Atelier Logic, as well as a pair of
There's no point for a gun to suddenly turn into a rifle.
Weapons that may have been created by Yore of Distortion Detective fame, though the term Atelier translates to workshop, but also is attributed to a certain quality of said workshop, and Yore claims to only sell to unique individuals. So it makes sense that she might have sold this sort of weapon to a color fixer. As well, we see elements of the Atelier's logic during the events of the game with the bullets used by Full Stop Office. Next, we have the Zelkov Workshop, which is two specific weapons which Roland's wife was demonstrated to use quite often in his flashback, as it is a combination of a mace and battle axe, with the name Zelkov Workshop implying that they were more northern made, given that Zelkov is a Russian word. As well, the word ties back to the genus of a specific oak tree, which might be why the weapon is an axe head, but it is just as likely that the Zelkov Workshop created both weapons. Then you have the Old Boy Workshop, which is a massive hammer that Roland produces from his palm. The weapon has a clear inspiration, and it comes from the 2003 South Korean movie Old Boy, and more specifically, the famous corridor scene in which Dai Suo fends off a group of thugs while wielding a hammer, a weapon of choice that has become iconic for both the character and the movie. And then you have Alas Workshop, which is a massive lance-style weapon that Angelica was often depicted using alongside Roland in the flashback where they fought Blood Red Knight. Alongside this and Wheel Industry, a massive greatsword-like weapon, these seem to be direct references to video games, and more specifically, Monster Hunter. This of course being the lance and greatsword, with the Wheel Industry even looking very similar in design to the Wyvern Ignition style greatsword from Monster Hunter World. Though, following this, we have the Ragna Workshop, which is a claw gauntlet and dagger combination, which can draw its name from many different places, but I can say for sure that that gauntlet design clearly takes inspiration from Devil May Cry's Beowulf weapon, the same way that Mook Workshop is a katana that Roland draws in a similar fashion to Virgil's Judgment Cut, right down to the effect it leaves behind, which is all directly intentional, as the game designer and project director Lee Yumi describes. For Roland's combat pages, I drew inspiration for their presentation from the combo attacks in Devil May Cry, a game series I am a fan of. A huge thanks to the artists who got the staggering amount of poses done for Roland the Weapons Master. Which means, canonically, Roland's battles in real time resemble that of Devil May Cry combo mads, which I just think makes him cooler than most other characters by default, though this inspiration can be felt more directly in the usage of his special page, Furioso.
Bird Street out of boost.
Ow, fuck.
And using the full power of the Black Silence, Roland slays his longest-lived friend, returning to Angela now prepared for what's to come, before a knock at the door of the library disturbs everything, as, all throughout the story of Runa, Argilia, the brother of Angelica and color fixer in his own right, has gathered a group of like-minded individuals who have all distorted in one way or another, with plans of claiming the library and its light for themselves, and amongst the group is a good few people who Roland has had a long history with, as he is the reason they ended up distorting in the first place. Firstly, you have Philip, or the Crying Children, which is the most recent victim of Roland's road to revenge. Philip has met with the library at multiple times throughout the story of the game, and each time his mind has been shattered in a new way. Though, technically, he isn't a direct victim of Roland in the same way that the others are, I just felt it was important to mention him first, given he's the one we follow the closest throughout the story of the game. Then next you have Aline, the Church of Gears cult leader and daughter of the scientist who abducted people off the streets to turn into gears that Roland killed during his Rampage. And then you have the powerful wolf-like woman, Tanya, who used to be part of the Middle Finger before Roland completely devastated an entire syndicate by himself. As well, you have Pluto, the man that Roland screwed over with his cleverly worded contract that would eventually result in him becoming Yesterday's Promise, a distortion which can essentially use magic via contracts. There's even Bremen, who you can sort of tie back to Roland's own actions back in District 9 when he killed the pianist, though they aren't all that closely connected to Roland. Yet they each all possess a grudge to bear against the world because of Roland's actions. He could be seen as the turning point in each one of their lives that led them to distorting. So in a way, he is just like Angela was to him for these people. Though, most importantly of this group, is Blood Red Knight, the distortion that Roland and Angelica killed prior to the events of the game by at least 10 years, and her partner, Jehan, the puppeteer, the scientist which Roland destroyed the puppet-making facility of, and these two together have unceremoniously revived his wife's body and turned it into a puppet. All thanks to the request of their leader, the psychotic Blue Reverbation, Argelia, who, alongside crashing through the library, begins to reveal Roland's whole scheme to Angela, stating loudly that his appearance in the library was no coincidence, and that he had plans for Angela that he wasn't directly sharing, even making it clear to Angela that she was directly the reason for Roland's suffering. Though before his cover could be blown completely, the library as a whole receives its new series of guests. And one by one the ensemble crumbles, with even Roland conquering Argelia, having the fated duel that their literary inspirations never quite got to have. And soon after, Angela's finish line was in sight. And because of that, Roland decided to make his move now, before it was too late. He stood before Angela and explained to her his reasoning. And seeing now, at the very end, she hoped to release herself, alongside all abnormalities and librarians within the library, onto the city under the guise of seeking freedom from her restrictive life before this. He knew he must eliminate her, as she had proven herself to be a monster like all the others in the city. Just another dime-a-dozen sob story, but yet, she was still his friend, and that is why he needed to kill her with the mindset of a city dweller. Now donning the perception-blocking mask and Black Silence gloves, Roland's boss fight begins. And this boss fight is my absolute favorite from the whole game, with it being this onslaught of raw emotion, with Roland's distorted self forcibly dragging the library through a stage show reprising the most awful moments of his life, starting first with his own lonely self staring down something greater than him, the mask removing his identity as Roland from the player as well. You were then transitioned into the interior of the former L-Corp during the Smoke Wars, with Roland becoming this withering horror, a massive monster which is supposed to be both the embodiment of the Smoke Wars trauma, but also the creature behind the smoke which embedded its horror into Roland's own mind. Though, beyond this, we reach Phase 3, in the lair of the Blood Red Knight, the location where Roland and Angela truly became a pair. This is what I consider to be the real birth of the Black Silence, as it is together that they utilize the full fury of the title. As well, Roland appears here in a fully distorted form, which seems actually to take direct inspiration from Agent and the invisible black matter ghost of that series. As well, Angelica's appearance here is supposed to represent both a spirit mixed with smoke, tying back to Roland gaining his emotions from the effect of L-Corp smoke, but also representing Angelica's passing, and making her sort of a specter connected to the Black Silence. It is also this moment that tells me that the Black Silence isn't a single person, but the combination of Angelica and Roland working together, two parts of a single identity, with the purpose of this phase being to play out the major turning point of Roland's life, as the player must engage with the slaying of Angelica to recreate the death that drove Roland to madness. As well, an interesting detail about this phase is that Roland and Angelica both have a passive that represents where they were during the events of the White Nights and Dark Days. Firstly, Angelica has a debuff effect which applies to her if you target and remove Roland from the fight, called Dearly Parted, which inflicts Angelica with Grief-Stricken, a multi-stack debuff that represents her weakened state during the pianist's attack, whereas Roland has a very similar passive of the same name that triggers if Angelica dies. This is called Rampage, and gives Roland a stamina hit in favor of greatly increasing his damage and speed, which of course represents his rampage following Angelica's death. though eventually you are able to push the boss into its next phase. With a stage transition, Roland stands before the library in a gray landscape of destruction, likely representing the state in which he wished to leave the city in. This stage of the fight represents the beginning of his rampage alongside the time he spent in the library, with each card in his deck comprised of memories of time spent in the library, all the people that he's killed, all the friends that he's slaughtered, all in pursuit of this goal. Though the most standout card in this deck is one not tied to his time in the library, these being Scream and Furioso, as it depicts possibly the most devastating moment in his life. The moment he found Angelica's body fused to the piano, a single bloody hand hanging limply from it. As well, with this transition into the next stage of the fight, you are greeted with Roland's boss theme, Gone Angels by Project Millie, and it is a masterpiece in and of itself. Not only do you have the tragic irony of the only instrument of the song being a piano, which feels very intentional, as you only hear the song after reenacting the death of Angelica in the face right before this, but also the lyrics of the song depict a dialogue between Roland and Angela, repeating not only his whole motivation for wanting to kill Angela, but also showing signs of his grief and hesitation in this decision. And eventually the fight will transition into its fifth and final stage, with Roland being surrounded by masked copies, which represent the different personalities he's adopted over his life. These forms even take on the names of the ego pages which Roland had collected through the floor of General Works. Which reminds me, throughout the game, Roland has been dealing with his own unique set of abnormalities on the Keter floor, though only a few of them really relate to him, as he shares the Keter floor story with Angela. Though the ones that do directly represent him are both the Heart of Aspiration and Pinocchio the Liar, with the Heart of Aspiration being a tool abnormality that brings out a strong aspiration in those who engage with it, though it also requires careful monitoring in its usage, as aspiration in unchecked quantities often results in unstable frenzy, which drove many of those who engaged with it to begin mindlessly killing. Which I believe ties to Roland in a very obvious way. The same can be said about Pinocchio the Liar as well, as Roland is a master of imitation. And it's an element of his character that existed long before the library, with him imitating his wife's fighting style, to being able to copy the actions of those he slain in the library, to even pretending to be a grade 9 nobody, a grade 1 information specialist, and even, of course, pretending to be the Black Silence. Roland is a man who wears a near endless series of masks throughout the game, and the developers of the game have said one of the most enjoyable parts about making his sprite sheet was, at first glance, you could see him as the nothing nobody rookie that he claimed to be. But then looking back at them, it's very obvious to see how these sprites also represent him holding back. Roland is constantly pretending, building up a mask full of lies, though you could also describe Pinocchio's desire to be a real boy as tying back to Angela as well, which, speaking of shared abnormalities, Bloodbath is the first abnormality fought on the Keter floor, and likely the first one fought in the whole game. And it shares a spot in both Roland and Angela's heart, as it's an abnormality that can represent the overpowering sorrow which tries to drag you deeper into your despair. And those who know the significance of that bathtub understand why it relates to Angela, but also the action of letting your sorrows drag you deeper into despair is almost exactly why Roland keeps rephrasing the prayer for loving sorrow. Though, soon enough, the library would bring Roland's rampage to a stop, and sitting in defeat before his friend, Roland accepts his death, encouraging Angela to take his head and obtain her freedom, or else he would take hers. Though, after a series of revelations on her own, Angela chooses to spare Roland, believing that someone needed to bring an end to the vicious cycle of death which created both of them. As well, she didn't want to kill in order to become free. Realizing her desire for freedom came from a person long since lost to most. Angela, the artificial intelligence that was in charge of Lobotomy Corp, and Angela, the director of the library, had become two separate beings.